So I've been messing around with the DOS machine quite a bit lately, and well, the scope of this machine has sort of changed. It's no longer just a DOS machine. It's now also doubling as a 95 machine. And I've been accomplishing that by just swapping out the compact flash card in the back. This is the 95 card, and because I don't have any more compact flash cards, it's an SD to compact flash, and then compact flash to IDE. I know that sounds terrible, but somehow this works fine. Did I just... No! Oh no. So tragedy just struck. I went to go plug this in like this. I had it in sideways, and I just bent one of the pins in the CF reader. That's just great. Oh, ooh, that was almost tragic. I don't think I ever showed this before. Check out this chassis flex on this thing. It's pretty wild. Okay, now that the detour is out of the way, if you want to actually learn more about this machine, I made a whole video about it back in 2021 when I first kind of built this. Basically, it's a Pentium 133 socket 7 system. Yeah, I've been running DOS and Windows 3.1 on it, and you know what? This whole machine, as it already was perfectly fine. I actually wasn't gonna touch this at all in terms of like upgrades or anything. But then I've kind of wanted to mess around with really early 3D games for a while. You know, stuff from like 96 to like 97. And so I wanted a 95 machine, but I figured instead of trying to build a whole other one, which I mean I could do that, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense considering I already had the CF card, easily accessible, very easy to switch out. So I figured, you know what, since this is already like pretty much everything else from the system is already from like 1997, might as well just turn this into the 95 machine and just, you know, have it be dual purpose and just swap between the cards. So I've already made 2 upgrades to this off camera. So the first one you may have spotted if you have a keen eye. Yeah, there's something gold in there. Yeah, so I may have gotten kind of lucky and found an AW64 gold. So I've had this thing for probably at least a year now, and I just didn't bother putting it in here until just recently. Reason being is that, well, I already liked the ESS sound card that I had in here. And the second thing is that, well, I'm not a super big fan of the AW64 Gold. I know that's going to sound like insane, like who doesn't like this thing? I know you can change the sound fonts and stuff on here, but my impression of this card has always been tainted by the horrible, the absolutely awful guitar on the default sample set. That guitar is just so underwhelmingly weak that, like, I don't know, my impression of this card has just been forever tainted by that. This card sounds really good for certain things, like in Descent. I think this card actually sounds pretty good. It's like getting close to giving like the SC55 a bit of a run for its money, in my opinion. Of course, the bass on the Roland is better. But yeah, now that I've gotten to use it, I'd say my impressions are a little better. And I'm very glad that I didn't pay anywhere close to what these things go for on eBay. I got this for like, you know, thrift store kind of price. So yeah, I am very grateful to have found this locally. Definitely a welcome addition to the machine. Now, the second thing that I've upgraded is the video card. Now, this is the card I had in here the last time you saw it. This is an S3 Verge DX, which, you know, is another, which is one of the early 3D accelerators. I believe the DX came out in 1997. The original Verge was 96. It is not that great of a 3D accelerator. It's a great 2D card. It's great for DOS. If you find one of these and you need a DOS video card, this honestly works pretty well. I can recommend it. So I could have kept this in here because, you know, S3 Verge. It supports S3D, which was S3's own proprietary API. There's a okay number of games that support S3D. I want to say there's about a dozen or so. So I could have left this in here if I really wanted to, but I've been wanting to mess around with ATI's CIF for quite a while. So I actually have switched over to this 8 megabyte ATI 3D Rage Pro. Now this is actually a Rage Pro Turbo PCI. If you're wondering what the turbo means, it means literally nothing. It's just a driver update. I'm not even kidding. This is the same chip as the original Rage Pro. They just released better drivers for it, and they called it a new chip. That's true, by the way. I'm not joking about that. They actually did that. This one's a little bit unique because it actually has TV outputs, which I don't think is super common. Yeah, this has 8 megabytes of VRAM. It's a lot better than the 4 that the S3 Verge has. This is a lot faster than the S3 Verge. This is like what I'd consider the first like acceptable 3D accelerator from ATI. This came out in 1997. The first two Rage cards were not great. This one's a lot better. This was also available on AGP, but we don't have AGP, so we're sticking with PCI. And you know what? I've been using this card, and I've actually gotten a pretty good opinion of it. I actually think it's not too terribly bad. However, there's been one persistent issue that I've noticed while using this card, and that issue is that the performance just seems lower than it actually should be. Now, why would that be? Is it because we're using the PCI version? Well, not likely. This was extremely early days for AGP, so PCI wasn't being totally maxed out yet. So I don't think it's PCI's fault. Is it the RAM? Well, 32 megabytes for, like 1997. I mean, that was a decent amount, so I don't think it's that. Is it just the video card itself just not being very fast? Well, I don't think so either, because you can run games at 640 by 480, and it'll run not great, like 10 to 15 FPS a lot of the time, but you can drop the resolution all the way down to like 320 by 240, and you'll get like almost exactly the same frame rate. That pretty much only leaves the CPU as actually being the bottleneck, which I didn't really expect to run into, but it does kind of make sense. I mean, this is an original Pentium 133, no MMX, so this is from like mid-1995, and I'm trying to run like 1997 games on it, which I know 2 years sounds like nothing by today's standards, but 2 years back then, world of difference. Like, this was ancient history by 1997, so yeah, I think it's just a CPU bottleneck. I will say though, one of the things about these early 3D accelerators, kind of the whole point of them was to help speed up your old system, and I don't know if I'd say it really has increased the speed a whole lot over software rendering, but it certainly has helped the image quality out, and you can run at higher resolutions, so it is somewhat doing its job. Just a little unfortunate that we do have to upgrade the CPU to really get the full performance out of it. Oh well, it is what it is. There's a couple options we could go with upgrading the CPU. Obviously, I could upgrade it to a faster Pentium, and I already have a Pentium MMX 233 megahertz, but while that is a great, fantastic chip, that would honestly be a perfect choice for this, I'd rather not put it in here because I'd like to do some like Socket 7 kind of comparisons and benchmarking at some point. It would kind of suck having it tied up in here all the time. I got a couple of Cyrix chips I could use. They would be faster, definitely an integer performance, but the floating point is going to really hold us down. It would be an upgrade, but not really to the same point that I'd want. So that kind of leaves us with one last practical option, and that is this. This is an AMD K6. Now, this is a 200 megahertz one. This is sort of right in the middle of the original batch of K6s. These early ones came out in sort of mid-1997. The later revisions, which ran at a lower voltage and were on a smaller process node, those went all the way up to like 300 megahertz. So this is right in the middle of the original batch, which was like 166 to 233. So we're not going for like the best of the best or anything. This is just a very practical upgrade, an upgrade that I could have seen someone who had like a, sort of similar config to this, that they would have made. Obviously, they wouldn't have had a 1998 motherboard, but this would have made a lot of sense as an upgrade, especially if they were already upgrading their video card. So yeah, I actually haven't tested out this K6 at all yet. I've never really gotten to use an original K6. I've used plenty of K6-2s, but never an original K6, so I'm pretty excited for this. Should be pretty simple. Thankfully, there's nothing really in the way of the CPU socket on this board. Here we go. Oh, geez. Took way longer than necessary. And well, there she is. Good old Pentium 1. This is a good chip. I do really like this. I don't know why this is... It's like greasy. How the heck did that happen? I know I didn't put it in like that. That's strange. Let's get her in there. Not a single bent pin. That dropped in beautifully. I'm just using really cheap thermal paste because honestly it doesn't really matter, and it's probably just about as good as the stuff they used back in the day. Alright. And now I get to do the fun task of changing all the jumpers. Oh boy. Alright, so I've been messing around with the K6 now for about a week or so, and well, I figured it was appropriate that we run benchmarks both before and after, so we can, of course, assess the upgrade, because what upgrade is complete without benchmarks? Now, the upgrade maybe wasn't quite as big of an upgrade as I thought it would be, and I think I was putting my expectations maybe slightly too high, because it makes sense. The K6 was not going to be as fast clock for clock as the Pentium. I should have known that, so expecting a huge gain was probably putting my faith in it a little too high, but that's not to say that it didn't increase performance, because it definitely did. So I decided to start off with some synthetic benchmarks like Final Reality. In the GPU test, it got a score in 2D of 1.02 and a 3D score of 2.11, and you rendering everything on the CPU in software mode, 2D got a 1.07 and 3D got a 0.23. So 3D score is pretty bad. I'm not sure why the 2D score is better on the CPU than it is on the GPU, but yeah, I don't know. I've never really used Final Reality a whole lot, so I'm not super familiar with it. And then on the K6, on the GPU, in 2D, it got a 1.53, and in 3D, 2.49, so definitely a nice increase there. And on the CPU, 2D was a 1.56, and 3D was a 0.36. So the CPU is still not great for rendering 3D by itself, but you can definitely see that it is giving the GPU a nice, much-needed boost in performance. And then a benchmark that is way out of this computer's league, 3D Mark 99. On the Pentium 133, it got a score of 695 3D marks, and CPU marks was a 994. And on the K6, it got 831 3D marks, and the CPU score was 1145. So, not a huge difference in terms of, 3D mark score, but then again, this benchmark is, way too new for this computer, so it makes sense that we didn't see a ton of scaling. Moving on to actual games, in Windquake at 320 by 240, the Pentium got a score of 25 FPS, 25.1. So it is the bare minimum faster than the Pentium was, which would have kind of hoped for more. In GL Quake at 640 by 480, the Pentium got 21.9, and at 320 by 240, it only got 22. So you can see here what I'm talking about, where the GPU is actually being CPU bottlenecked, because, you'd think changing the resolution down by half would increase performance, but it doesn't really. And then on the K6 at 640 by 480, it got 26 FPS, and at 320 by 240, it got 31.6. So now we can see where the GPU bottleneck is starting to play in, and lowering the resolution is actually increasing performance. So it is kind of neat to see that. I don't know if this is the upper limits of the 3D rage, or if we're also hitting CPU bottlenecks here as well. I think it's kind of a combination of the two. Quake 2 in OpenGL, which I believe is 640 by 480. I didn't actually write this down. I'm going to have to check the footage to double check that. The Pentium got 9.7 FPS, so really not good. And then the K6 in OpenGL got 14.4 in 640 by 480. So not huge gains. It's definitely more playable in OpenGL, that's for sure. I also tested OpenGL on the K6 at 320 by 240, and the performance was basically exactly the same. So it's still a CPU bottleneck here. Just for the heck of it, I decided to run Half-Life because I was like, hey, the minimum requirements for Half-Life are a Pentium 133, so might as well try it out. And I didn't even bother loading up the actual game. I just loaded up the hazard course at 512 by 384. Yeah, it's not good. I'm not really surprised by that, considering that this is both not a great graphics card for it and not a good CPU for the game either. So I'm not really surprised by any of that. Moving on to games that use ATI's CIF API, which was their custom graphics API, because if you're not familiar with this time period in GPU history, basically every GPU vendor had their own custom API, along with supporting DirectX, and if you were really lucky, maybe supporting OpenGL. The CIF version of Wipeout, which is actually one of the very first games to use CIF, I think it was bundled with the original 3D Rage. Apparently this game is not runnable without MMX, which really surprised me. I mean, this game came out, or this port came out in 1996, and MMX would have been like brand new, so it's kind of weird that they would have required that. But yeah, I could not get this thing to boot at all on the Pentium. Playing it on the K6, it was pretty good at 640 by 480. Maybe not quite as smooth as I was expecting. I had seen some footage of it running on a Rage Pro at 640 by 480, and it was running better, but I think he was also running it on a Pentium 3, so that would kind of make sense there. I think we are still hitting kind of a CPU bottleneck. Lowering the resolution didn't really seem to help, so that kind of supports my theory. And there is actually a CIF version of Tomb Raider, and on the Pentium, it ran great at 640 by 480, all the details turned up. And on the K6, I think it ran even a little bit better. Croc in software mode at 320 by 240 ran pretty bad. It was not great on the Pentium. And in CIF, it still ran pretty bad at basically any resolution. It didn't really matter. It just was not going to run very well. And Croc on the K6 running in CIF, 640 by 480 was a lot better. Certainly not still perfect, but it was way better. There was actual moments where it was like smooth. And then the CIF version of Pod on the Pentium ran pretty badly at 640 by 480, and it again ran about the same at 512 by 384. I reinstalled the game with MMX for the K6 because, you know, you might as well take advantage of that as well. For some reason, this version of the game refuses to allow you to change graphical options. So I'm assuming it was running at 640 by 480. And it ran maybe a little bit better. It was still not great. I'm not really sure why it doesn't let you change graphical options, but I like reinstalled it twice with MMX. Maybe it's the MMX version that has issues, but yeah, I just could not get it to actually let me change graphical options. So I'm assuming it was 640 by 480, and there wasn't a huge increase. So that's a little disappointing, but I guess it is what it is. That's the magic of, you know, early PC software. So, I mean, I guess it did its job. I didn't really need the extra performance, but since I've been messing around with the 95 stuff, it made sense to upgrade it. Wasn't the biggest upgrade in the world, but maybe you found it fascinating. I don't know. I'll get use out of it. Probably still more as a DOS machine than a 95 machine, but hey, it's a fun side distraction, I guess. I did change over the LEDs, which that was like a solid hour because it's a really confusing layout and I had absolutely no idea how to actually do it. That was probably like a good hour of trial and error. And if you're wondering why it's 198 and not, well, obviously you can't do 200 because the hundredths digit can only be a 1. Why it's not 199? Well, 66 times 3, which is the bus and the multiplier setting, if you multiply that, it's actually 198. It just says 200, so technically 198 is the correct clock speed. This is not actually 200 megahertz, unless there's like a point megahertz somewhere that bumps it up. I don't know. 198. I just know how to put things in a calculator. That's what it says. So 198. So hopefully this video wasn't terribly long and hopefully not terribly boring either. I do have a more interesting video in the works. I say in the works. It's just in the works in my head. I haven't actually done anything with it yet. It should be coming out in June for a certain GPU June 3, which better be happening because I'm going to look really stupid if it doesn't happen. Anyways, I don't know what else to say. It's a computer. The camera is not doing justice just how nasty this shade of yellow is. Like, it looks really bad in person. Also, the case is dirty, but yeah, you get up close to this. Yeah, it's just such an unpleasing yellow color. I could retro bright it, but I don't know. I'm kind of attracted to the nastiness. I don't know how to describe it.